Hello and welcome viewers. You're watching this special presentation of Sansad TV with your host Kriti Mishra. In his latest book, India at 100, Envisioning Tomorrow's Economic Powerhouse, Mr. K.V. Subramanian, Executive Director, International Monetary Fund and former Chief Economic Advisor, outlines India's path to becoming a $55 trillion economy by 2047, up from $3.5 trillion today. He's joining us in the studio for deeper insights. Welcome, Dr. Subramanian, and what a pleasure to have you in our Parliament studio.
My pleasure, Kriti.
Thank you so much. So I'll begin the show with your quote, and it says, as long as India is able to clock a GDP growth rate of 8% per annum in real rupee terms, it has the potential to emerge as a Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy by 2047, unquote. Please help us understand that.
I'm glad you actually started with that, Kriti. I'm reminded of the time when in 1993, a few years Sachin had already played test match cricket, and his potential based on his past performance was clearly visible. At that time, one of the doyens of Indian cricket, Sunil Gavaskar, had said that if Sachin, by the time he finishes his career, he doesn't score at least 40 international hundreds and 12,000 international runs, I'll personally go and strangle him. Now, that was actually a paternalistic statement which captured the potential that that Sachin Tendulkar had. I think there's an important learning there about the Indian economy, because based on the performance in the past, in the last 30 years, but especially over the last 10 years, I think the potential for Indian economy to actually register that 8% growth is definitely there. But at the same time, there's also another very important learning, and that's why I find this example quite compelling, which is that while the assessment of Sachin's potential by Sunil Gavaskar definitely would have encouraged him, but it's not just the potential that translated into performance. He had to work very hard. He had to get over setbacks that definitely came during his almost 2-decade-long career. In a similar way, Indian government, actually Indian policymakers, both at the central and state level, have to come together to actually implement good policies to ensure that we are able to deliver that 8% real growth. I think that is the real critical element here. Because if you look at on average since 1991, we have had about 7% plus growth. So 8% is actually ambitious, just that little bit of stretch goal. At the same time, it is achievable. And I'll just take you through the economics of this. See, one of the key aspects to understand is that the rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar affects what will be the likely value of the economy in 2047. Let me share a couple of examples. Let's take Japan. From 1970 to 1995, Japan's economy grew almost 26 times, from about $215 billion to $5.1 trillion. And during this time, the Japanese currency appreciated more than 4 times, remember, appreciated, from about 350 yen to the dollar to 85 yen to the dollar. Now, I am not projecting any appreciation of the currency. That can happen, but which will help really, but I'm just projecting a much lower rate of depreciation, because inflation has fallen secularly from 7% plus, up until 2016 to 5% on average from 2016 when we implemented the inflation targeting regime. As a result, I'm projecting less than 1% rate of depreciation of the rupee. If you just put the numbers together, 8% real growth, 5% inflation, that's 13% in nominal terms, 8 plus 5. And let's approximate rate of depreciation to be 1%. So 12% is the rate of growth in dollar terms, 13 minus 1. Using the rule of 72, which actually is a very useful rule to know how many years it takes to double our money. If you remember the NSE certificates, when they actually provided 12% return, money doubled every 6 years. That's 12 times 6 is 72. So in a similar way, at 12% rate of growth in dollar terms, the GDP will double every 6 years. Over a 24-year period from 2023 to 2047, therefore there'll be 4 doublings. And the Indian GDP in 2023 was 3.28 trillion. Let me just approximate it to 3.25. So 3.25 to 6.5, 6.5 to 13, that's the second doubling, 13 to 26, third doubling, and 26 to 52, which is close to the 55 trillion number. It also provides a good understanding of why others are estimating the GDP to about 26 trillion, Ernst & Young, for instance.
Yes.
If you have only 3 doublings, which actually will result, if you assume the rate of depreciation to be what it has been in the past, you stop at 26, and you don't get the additional doubling. So this explains in some sense therefore the potential, but at the same time also the need for good policies to deliver that 8% for us to be the $55 trillion economy.
Well, absolutely, that's an interesting analogy and very interesting mathematical calculation also. But let's talk about the factors. Where is this optimism stemming from?
So, a few aspects. As I said earlier, in your response to your first question, it is the past performance that is actually delivering the optimism, because we have, especially during COVID and after, during a time when the global economy has been struggling to grow at good rates, India has been growing very well because of implementing of good policy. And that's why actually the optimism about us being able to redouble those policies is something that is important. But if you look at the various drivers, first, if you look at the Indian economy, estimates vary, but anywhere between half to maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the economy is still informal. And all of us recognize that formal sector firms are far more productive than informal sector firms. So the formalization will increase productivity, number one. Number two, even if you look at our formal sector firms, they are still significantly behind their global peers. Maybe some firms would be basically 1/4 of their global peers, while others might be 1/5. So there is still a lot of catch up, on productivity. And this can happen from the momentum that we have on entrepreneurship and innovation. And just to give some data on entrepreneurship, from 2004 to 2014, new firm creation, this is World Bank data, had grown at a CAGR of 3.2%. Since then, from 2014, it's growing at orders of magnitude higher, which is what has led to the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world. On innovation, for the first time in 2019, India entered the top 50 countries, in innovation using the Global Innovation Index. We would have languished actually in the top 100, before that. Now we're in the top 40. Now I'm not happy with the top 40. Ideally, we should be actually in the top 15 or top 10, given that we are the 5th largest economy. But there is a momentum, and the entrepreneurship and innovation will push productivity growth in formal sector firms as well. And the third key driver is actually credit growth. And here again, the data is quite revealing. If you look at the global average for credit to GDP, private credit to GDP ratio, in 1960, Kriti, it was 60%. In 2020, India was at 58%. In other words, on credit creation, credit penetration in the economy, we are still 6 decades behind. And that generates actually significant opportunity, especially because of the public digital infrastructure that's been created, the account aggregators, the ONDC, all those platforms which actually can be really used for data, driven lending. So overall, when you put these three drivers, and actually, of course, in the book, I've written about healthcare, education, bureaucratic reform, judicial reform. Those are all different levels of hanging fruits. Actually, think about it as there are fruits hanging at different levels. I think these three fruits, which is your formalization, the productivity in the formal, growth in the formal sector, and credit creation, are relatively lower hanging fruits. Once we pluck them and sort of utilize them for productivity growth, we can go to the other fruits. And there's enough work to be done over the last 2 decades to be able to actually deliver that productivity growth and thereby be able to have the 8%. And finally, let me give you 2 statistics here. If you use the Penworld tables data, which actually economists across the globe use to understand drivers of growth,
yes.
From 2002 to 2013, India's productivity grew at 1.3% per annum. From 2014 onwards, it is growing at 2.7% per annum. In other words, more than double. Now, some people will say, oh, why did that not translate into higher growth? It does not translate into higher growth because investment was lower because of the dual balance sheet problems that we had from the lending, etc. So now that the dual balance sheet problem is behind us, and the government itself has actually changed tack to invest so much in capital expenditures, the 35 to 38% investment to GDP ratio that we need for 8% growth with the productivity growth that has happened, I think that is already there. So we should be able to reap the benefits of that. Final statistic I want to give you is, if you look at the last 2 decades, the dollar rate of growth in nominal terms, the Indian economy has grown at 10%. Now, as I said, historically, the rate of depreciation of the currency has been about 3.5%. A decline in the rate of depreciation of 3.5% to 1% gives you another 2.5%.
That's right.
So 10% plus the 2.5% actually will be able to deliver that the growth that is required in dollar terms to double our GDP every 6 years, and thereby be able to become the $55 trillion economy in 2047.
So how do you demarcate between short-term reforms and long-term reforms?
So I think that's a very good follow-up question. as I just mentioned, the way I said, there are fruits that are hanging at different levels.
Yes.
So I would say the lower hanging fruits should be the ones that should be, plucked immediately or in the short run. But at the same time, it's important equally to be able to pluck some of the fruits that are actually reachable, but are still, not necessarily low-hanging fruits. Like I said, bureaucratic reform, judiciary. And here, let me actually point out, of course, there's been good work on emphasizing specialization in the bureaucracy. But I want to point as an example and as a real anecdote. In 2014, there was this chess match, very well publicized match between Bill Gates and Magnus Carlsen. Magnus Carlsen, as we all know, is the chess champion, highest ELO-rated player ever. And what was the outcome of that chess game? Bill Gates, who's so accomplished, so capable, lost in 80 seconds. Just 80 seconds to Magnus Carlsen. Yeah. Now, I can speculate that actually if it was the reverse, where Magnus Carlsen had challenged, Bill Gates to software development, he would have been made mincemeat equally of, I think these examples illustrate how even a very, very capable, and a very accomplished generalist cannot necessarily compete that well with a specialist. And this is an area where I think which requires emphasis. There's been good work that's been done. I had the privilege of being able to work with some very good specialists, in the ministry when I was part of government, but we need to do this more so that we can actually benefit from specialization. And I emphasize this because in the next 2.5 decades, there will be potential headwinds. But the global economy is one that actually is sort of experiencing shocks. And I think that specialization will really help in us being able to come up with creative solutions to these, headwinds that might potentially come.
There's another very important aspect that you point out, that is about manufacturing.
Yep.
We, of course, miss the bus. Manufacturing has long been our Achilles heel. You talk about reforms in land, labor, capital, and logistics as well. Mm-hmm. But do you see tangible impact of Make in India initiative, Startup India initiative, and there are several initiatives that the government has taken to boost manufacturing in the country?
So this is one area where, while there's been, some good growth, but I think that more needs to be done for sure. Okay. And how do I say that there's been some good growth? If you look at last year's, and the economic survey highlighted this as well, the growth in manufacturing was 9.9% in real terms, which actually is a very good growth. On a base of 8%, 8.2% GDP growth, 9.9% in manufacturing is good. But, you pose the question about India having missed the manufacturing bus. Whenever we talk about that, I also want to, mention in the same breath that it is because of the policy failures that India has actually not been able to utilize the manufacturing, growth that has happened in the rest of the world. Why? Because if you think about a manufacturing firm, what are the inputs it needs? It needs land, labor, capital, logistics, power, scale, economies of scale, because scale really helps the firm to be able to spread its fixed costs over a larger denominator. Now, on each one of these inputs, when you take a manufacturing sector firm, the entrepreneur faces anywhere between 15 to 20% higher costs compared to global peers. You put it all together across 6 inputs, if you're actually facing 15 to 20% higher costs, that accumulates into almost double the cost.
And you're not competitive.
And you're not competitive then, actually. And this is an aspect where actually we need to really, understand that, for instance, in 1991, my current employer, International Monetary Fund, when the program was actually with India was done at that time, labor reforms were emphasized at that point in time, was a recommendation at that point in time. Here we are 33 years later, actually, and we are, of course, the codes have been passed, but actually we're waiting for subordinate legislation to be passed. Similarly, many other, land markets, for instance, capital, these markets actually are continue to be distorted, and reforms are extremely critical. And here I will take the opportunity to emphasize the need for states to be doing reforms. And here I want to make 2 points. Where a lot of spotlight is put on the central budget, rightly so. But equally, for instance, especially in some of the more developed states, where manufacturing growth can happen, we need to be questioning, when the budget comes, what are the policy reforms that have been announced? Are the CIIs, the FICCIs, and the ASSOCHAMs of the world need to be training their spotlight on the state budget and saying, what are the reforms that have been announced? I'll just use as an example. I was in Chennai for to talk about the book. In order to be able to travel a distance of 22 kilometers, it took me an hour. It took me an hour. And that is because many of the roads that were there actually are, were in really bad shape. And I was thinking now, for instance, this is clearly a state level subject, obviously municipal ideally, but that decentralization has not happened, and therefore the responsibility we have to hold it with the state.
Yes.
Why can't we use Google Maps data to be able to track, for instance, what's the average speed in various cities, and look at competition and compare with global standards? For instance, right now, because I live in Washington DC, I was just comparing 22 kilometers is 15 miles. We would have covered that distance in 15 minutes there.
Right.
I think we need to start doing these comparisons, and part of the reason why in the book I've brought in a lot of global examples is so that we really compare ourselves, benchmark ourselves with the best in the world. And second point here I actually want to mention is, in a federal structure, there is power, of course, at the state level. But whenever we talk about governance, power and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. And I think it is really important, therefore, when one talks about the power in a federal structure, it is equally important to emphasize the responsibility in the federal structure as well. And whether it's us as citizens or the media or the industry bodies need to be now asking the question, when states talk about their power, we need to ask them, what about your responsibilities? For instance, irrespective of the political dispensation, I have no hesitation in saying that, across 3 decades, the union government has actually done a lot of reforms. But states actually, they need to be pulling up their acts now, because a lot of subjects, whether it's land, for instance, that's a state subject, where, labor, a lot of the laws actually are at the state level. Power, putting up smart meters, that is something that is a state, because, if there is a reduction in power, pilferage, that will reduce the cost of power to corporates. Many of the ease of doing business aspects are at the state level. So we need to really be asking these questions of our state governments. When a state budget is presented, I think at least there should be equal amount of spotlight, with the CIIs, the FICCIs basically discussing that budget threadbare and asking the questions, why aren't there reforms?
So basically what the government has been saying, the NDA government has been saying that, of course, we've been talking about cooperative federalism, but it's time for competitive federalism as well.
Exactly. I think that's very well put. Competitive federalism can really help in carrying these reforms at the state level, because those will be, important in being able to deliver this 8% growth. As we've discussed, not just in manufacturing, but even in, for instance, service sector, agriculture. Take agriculture, for instance. One of the I have a chapter in the book where, using data and, economic arguments, I actually show that the benefits of status quo ends up being, going to a few. While for all the rhetoric that we actually, on the farmer, it is a fact that the small farmer is the one that gets hurt because of the status quo. I'll give you a specific example. Take, for instance, the Essential Commodities Act. It is an intrinsic aspect of agriculture that, supply is seasonal, demand is all through the year. When you have supply that is seasonal and demand is all through the year, you have to store. There is, otherwise, if supply were, all through the year and demand were all through the year, you don't need to store. But here, supply is seasonal. And yet the Essential Commodities Act, which was passed in 1961, at a time when India faced food shortages, equates almost all storage to hoarding. And I'm sure all of us remember those Bollywood movies where a Jeevan would actually be shown as a hoarder when he was storing. I think that is something that we have to relook. And these are aspects. Similarly, at the state level, some of these farm laws, which actually are continuing to hurt our small farmers, need to really be put on the spotlight. In some sense, state-level subjects, now states need to be showing the necessary desire to actually reform, and benefit those that actually are more vulnerable, and those that have not gotten as much benefits at the state level because of some of these status quo persisting.
Very legit point. But again, talking about another aspect, you talk about starting in India, that this is the time to start in India, in Western India. And you also talked about budget. I'm reminded how there was abolition of the angel tax, the bête noire of all the startups.
Yes.
What is the impact on the ground that you foresee in coming years?
I think this is a very important move. I will club that with also the removal of the indexation benefits, because when we look at a startup, for instance, a successful startup very likely will have at least 10x multiplication in its net worth, maybe 100x as well. And when you talk about, because let's say it's starting at 100 rupees and then the actual value, let's say 10,000 or maybe even a lakh, then the indexation actually on 100, it doesn't really make much of a difference. So the reduction in the tax rate from 20% to 12.5% can make a big difference difference to startups, together with the angel tax, which actually, many times ends up becoming sort of a pain point. It's not that the startups had problem paying that tax, but some of the difficulties, at the ground level is what bothers them, right? And the combination of both of these thereby relaxes some of the energy that may go into actually taking care of some of these pain points. They can concentrate on their products and on marketing their products and their business in general, and that will really help in my opinion, because this is an aspect that I actually have fundamentally believed that in a lot of startups, the entrepreneurial ecosystem needs to start solving India's problems.
That's right.
And I think it's been very good so far that many of our startups have actually been inspired by ideas that have been implemented in advanced economies. That's absolutely good. That's the way the ecosystem develops. But I think now that given the maturity of the ecosystem, we have the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world. Today our startups need to be thinking about solving India's problems. There are many that I can actually, I don't have any interest in starting a firm myself, but I can lay out some ideas. For instance, as we were talking about, take climate change. Why can't we have, and one of the aspects, there's a chapter on climate change as well. If you look at the overall sort of about 60 districts, and the Ministry of Home Affairs has actually looked at 20 districts that are most drought prone, most flood prone, and most cyclone prone, right? These 60 districts, if you have a startup that goes and collects local level data and being able to then predicts basically the likelihood of these natural disasters, and also builds infrastructure that can very quickly move into these districts actually to be able to protect people, I think that will make a big difference. It will reduce some of the worries actually of climate change and help climate mitigation. These are areas where startups can certainly work on. Even for instance, some of the renewable energy aspects. There are many examples. Or for instance, one of the ideas that I've talked about is the Care BNB system. Along the lines of the Airbnb. One of the reasons why actually for instance, women oftentimes cannot participate as much in the labor force is because they need to take care of either their young children or their elderly parents or parents-in-law. Now, and here, women oftentimes actually maybe don't feel as comfortable leaving it with other caretakers. Here, if there is a technology where actually, and it need not be only women, actually the men can do this too. For instance, if I had on when I had young kids, on my phone, if I had an app, at any point in time where I maybe get a few minutes, I'm free from, let's say, work, I just open that app and I'm able to see exactly how my caretaker is taking care of my kids. The caretaker also knows then that he or she can be watched at any point in time, and that will then lead to a lot of difference in the way in which they take care. That will then inspire actually the trust, the confidence that we can leave our kids and our elderly with caretakers, which will release a lot of the constraints that bind women to actually not go to work. And I think therefore this idea of basically the Care BNB, where women themselves go and provide this care, and women also avail. They are the suppliers and the customers as well. And I think in solutions like these, I think there is absolutely no paucity of creativity in India, especially in the entrepreneurial talent. If they just can sort of just change that mindset and look, I want to solve India's problems and thereby do good for myself and also for the country. Because one of the aspects, and this I've highlighted, is that entrepreneurs not only do they bring productivity, but they really help in job creation.
That's true.
And that is something which, I can't be an entrepreneur, but I respect them a lot because, when somebody gets a job, the entire family gets uplifted.
That's true. That's true.
And that is something which, so I think overall, our entrepreneurs really need to think about actually how to solve India's problems and thereby benefit themselves and the nation.
I hope all these startup enthusiasts are hearing that, and you may charge your royalty also. But before we wind up this conversation, and I'm not sounding pessimistic, but look, there's escalation of conflict in Middle East. There's financial stress. There's slowdown in global trade. There are downside risks to global growth. Do you think that still India can emerge as the economic powerhouse in this global landscape?
I think it's a very appropriate question. Let me again, sort of draw on some of the examples that I gave. Let's start with Japan, for instance. As I mentioned, 1970 to 1995, the Japanese economy grew by 26 times. Now, was this a honeymoon period for the economy, global economy? No. This was a period where there was war, basically, especially the Vietnamese war. This was a period where actually the oil shock happened and the hyperinflation as a result. And yet the Japanese economy was able to actually creatively get over these problems to go 25 times. times. Similarly, if you look at actually, China over the 1996 to 2021 period, again, was this a honeymoon period? No, you actually had the global financial crisis, the demand side shock as a result of that. You had COVID, and you also had the war, Ukraine war, and supply side problems as a result. I think, in general, if you look at go and learn from these country cases, there's never been a period where there's, these headwinds have not been there. Even if I actually use, and this may be sort of something that is relatable, if you take the example of Sachin Tendulkar, from whom we started with, right? Yes, he had the headwind of basically having the tennis elbow surgery.
Right.
At the time when, Sunil assessed his potential, obviously he didn't anticipate. But equally, what is critical to understand is that there may be potential tailwinds as well. Whenever one estimates actually and looks into the future, there will be potential headwinds that could be potential tailwinds as well. And to give an example, I don't think Sunil Gavaskar at that time thought about the quartet of Rahul Dravid, VVS Lakshman, Viren Sehwag and Saurav Ganguly coming and supporting Sachin as a batsman and thereby releasing him and he being able to score as much runs, right? Similar, tailwinds also cannot be ruled out. I think they are important as well. I think there is no doubt that there will be headwinds and we need to be creatively thinking about how to come up with solutions. But we don't need to become pessimistic just because there are potential challenges. My view is actually to see an opportunity as a challenge, That's right. Some people may actually look for a challenge in every opportunity, but I think I would prefer the former.
Fantastic. On that sanguine note, and of course, those volley of analogies, cricket, Sachin Tendulkar, Gavaskar, and of course, your CAA days, Thalinomics, Bittu Shruti. All these analogies will stay with us, but thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us.
My pleasure.
Well, viewers, that's all we had for you in this edition. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Sansad TV. Goodbye for now from my side.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.